Hi, I'm Jenny Rooke, the founder and managing director of Genoa Ventures, and I am so delighted to be here today with Dr. Carolyn Bertozzi, winner of the 2022 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and founder of many companies, including InterVenn BioSciences, which is one of Genoa's investments that we're quite proud of. Carolyn, thank you so much for agreeing to spend the time with me today to talk about your journey, and in particular, turning science into great companies.
Well, thank you. And it's wonderful for me to be here. And it's been a real pleasure getting to know you through the relationship of Genoa and InterVenn. And I'm just delighted to share the time.
Likewise. Thank you. Well, why don't we start with that journey, the journey of being a scientist who starts companies. InterVenn was not your first, and it's not your last either. This is part of a pattern. I'd love to hear the origins of that. How did you become a scientist who was not content to stick with your academic accomplishments, but wanted to translate that into companies?
Well, I think I first learned about the process of translating science from the laboratory into a company when I was a graduate student. And that was at UC Berkeley in the chemistry department back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I worked for a young professor who had aspirations of starting companies, and he would talk about that. Yeah. And as a graduate student, I was focused entirely on my thesis project. But, I saw him filing invention disclosures and trying to patent some of the work that we did. And I was a co-inventor on at least one patent from my PhD thesis work. So I had a very superficial view of the process all the way back in my early 20s, really. And then I got a real flavor for what that feels like when I was a young assistant professor. And my former postdoc advisor from UCSF wanted to start a company with me as a co-founder. So that was my very first co-founded company. And that was around the year, I'm going to say 1999 or 2000.
I was still fairly pioneering for bringing science out of the academic setting. There was, depending on what university you were in, not necessarily a lot of support for that. Did you find that there was resistance or misunderstanding among your either fellow graduate students or fellow professors?
Yes. I'm thinking back to those days, and fortunately, I think by the 1990s, the concept of the academic entrepreneur was fairly well established and appreciated in the Bay Area.
Right.
So, at Berkeley, at UC San Francisco, at Stanford. But even then, I remember there was a time when the chancellor of UCSF was rather negative on the idea that faculty would moonlight as entrepreneurs. And there definitely was a camp of faculty that looked down on that as a distraction from the purity of academic science. That has changed entirely.
Yes. Although unevenly, to your point. When I was getting my PhD in genetics in the 90s at Yale, there were a few outliers who were starting to make companies, but it was definitely not talked about, mentored. When I said I was graduating and going into industry, even my most understanding colleague, after hearing why I wanted to do it, eventually said, I get it. I can see why you'd want to do something less than science.
Oh, no.
So,
okay.
So you persevered, though. You thought that was important to do. You had some early mentorship around it being possible. What motivated you to do that, to say yes to your co-founder, for example?
Yes. Well, I think just the idea that work that I contributed to in the academic lab could potentially benefit human health and could directly benefit patients who were in need. That was something that really struck an emotional chord with me. And at the time, and you'll remember this being someone who was, in their 20s, in the late 80s and 90s, you'll remember that this was in the heyday of the AIDS crisis. And here in the Bay Area, I had many friends who had HIV and then progressed to AIDS, and they all died. This was before the advent of the protease inhibitors and the cocktails of drugs that now can keep a person with HIV alive for a normal lifespan. But back then, that was not the case. And so my PhD work actually focused on some things related to HIV. And I remember thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if I could actually do something for the people that I care about?
Yeah.
And eventually, during my postdoctoral years and then as a professor, I started to understand that the way you take your discoveries into a setting where they actually could help patients was through licensing opportunities and through entrepreneurship.
Well, interesting that you just called out those two options, because that can get overlooked. So you do have the option to do your science, you patent it, and you maybe rely on the university to run a licensing campaign, and a large pharma company might pick it up and commercialize it. That certainly is less work than taking time away from your academic work to found a company, co-found a company, recruit people to that, raise money. So how do you think about the why to go the entrepreneurship route?
It's interesting that you call that out, because I really never had the option to take the licensing route, where you hand off your discovery to usually a big pharmaceutical company that can then prosecute. Probably for the reason that the kind of research that I've done has been in areas of biology which were not in the mainstream.
Right.
And big pharmaceutical companies that are looking for academic licensing opportunities are usually looking for technologies they recognize, right? So things that are a little more in the mainstream. By contrast, if you work in areas that are, kind of way out in front of the mainstream, or, in an area that's not as widely appreciated, the chances that a third party will just come in off the street and license that is very low. And so really, in my experience, the only channel to get those kinds of discoveries to patients who need them is to start a company yourself and try to educate, investors and potential pharma partners about the nature of the science and the opportunity.
Right. So to take that additional risk that maybe an established company is not ready to, willing, or able to take that on because it's worth trying to get to that goal. But then, to your point, now you have to recruit a team around that, a team of people who are going to co-found the company, who are going to do the development, finance the company. So how do you go about that? And you have quite a data set of starting companies.
Right.
What are some of the ways to get people recruited to the cause?
It's a great question. And you also mentioned that when you were making your career decisions out of Yale, there wasn't much in the way of mentorship and even support from your academic advisors who were hoping that you would be a clone of them, right? And the first company that I co-founded, which was, again, back in 1999, we really found ourselves in a somewhat of a vacuum of mentorship, because at that time, we really didn't have any organizational structure around us that would help us. And so we did it, the old school way, which is you just talk to everybody you know and hope to make a connection somewhere and find someone who can help you. And the person who helped us happened to be, it was like the parent of a kid who happened to be on the same soccer team with one of the co-founders. I mean, this is not a scalable strategy, But fast forward now to the current time, and especially here in the Bay Area, the big universities like Stanford have an infrastructure to help their faculty launch companies. So we have, for example, entrepreneurship boot camps. There are short courses that our graduate students will take in the business school, where they get matched with business school students, and together they form mock companies. And investors from the local community, such as yourself, volunteer to come and help and provide mentorship. And so nowadays, it's, I think, a much more friction, I won't say frictionless, but the friction is much lower. Also, the attitudes, I would like to think that the attitudes of faculty have evolved to the point where we now understand the value, the excitement, the challenge of pursuing a career such as the one you pursued. And some of our very best students prefer a career of that type, and they don't want to be clones of their advisors. And I think faculty have evolved to the point where we also understand that our goal is not to clone ourselves. Our goal is to launch careers of people, and whatever career they choose is the career we support, right? So much has changed really in the ecosystem that's made it easier to start companies, both for faculty and also for young aspiring entrepreneurs like our recent graduates and postdoctoral fellows.
I've heard from our previous conversations, from your interviews, mentorship is very important to you. You're a renowned mentor in addition to being an acclaimed chemist. It sounds like part of your value system as a mentor is really discovering what each individual's path is and helping them get there, regardless of whether it looks exactly like yours or someone else's.
Yes. Well, that's the goal, right? And in fact, the line that I often hear myself saying to my students is, if you're excited about it, then I'm excited about it,
Nice.
Whatever it may be. Yeah. And so that might be that they want to pursue an internship for the summer in a venture capital firm, which, is an opportunity that's out there for people nowadays. And if they're excited about it, I'm excited about it. And if they want to pursue a career after they graduate as a scientist in industry or in the government or, working in science policy in Washington or going to finance or consulting or start a company, based on their thesis work sometimes. If they're excited about it, I'm excited about it. And that is my fundamental job.
Love it. So how often have you found yourself in a mentor or coach role relative to a former student or postdoc who's now in a company, maybe running a company that is a spin out from your lab that you're a co-founder of?
So that has happened a few times. I'm doing an inventory in my head. So right now I'm on company number 10.
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you. And 3 of the 10 were co-founded and led by students from my lab. Okay. And it was based on their thesis project. And typically the scenario is such that in the early stages of company building, I can provide some mentorship. And with each company, I'm more useful as a mentor because I'm learning each time. I learn something new that I can help with. But very quickly, when my students are in a leadership role and they're in the trenches, building the company and, interviewing the people to hire for the team and making decisions every day. And I can advise, but I'm at a distance. I'm not full-time in the company. And so the tables turn quickly. And after a few years, I find that I'm learning from my former students, maybe more than they're learning from me. So now I consider my trainees to be my go-to people for advice when I need it.
Right. And
to help me expand my own network. And that's, I think, really the beauty of science. It's you have an extended family.
Indeed.
And it's never a one-way street in terms of mentorship.
Well, let's talk about bumps in the road. The thing about startups, contrary to maybe some of the past few years, it's not always up and to the right. You often don't have everything you need. You don't have all the people that you need. You start out with some premise and find it doesn't work and need to change. It's definitely a winding path to success, and more often than not, they fail. Right? So, and yet you start them again and again, and I invest in them again and again. So hope springs eternal. Can you talk about some lessons learned about some of the rough times from starting these companies and what you've seen either from your experience or your team's experience has made a difference in succeeding?
That's just a great question. And, I mentioned before, I'm now on company number 10. Yeah. And each of those companies has its own totally independent story. And there's almost very little overlap between them in terms of the science, and the investors are all different actually in these companies too, with just a few exceptions. And you're right. When you start a company, you're full of enthusiasm. You have what you think is the best idea you've ever had, and your students are ready to go sometimes. And inevitably, not everything works out exactly as you plan. And you have to make adjustments along the way. Sometimes you have to reorganize your priorities. And I think the companies that are able to weather the inevitable storms, and some of those storms are technology or science storms, others are funding climate storms. Yeah. At the end of the day, you need to have great people. So the team that launches the company, at the leadership level, they have to be smart and creative and dedicated with a positive attitude, and they have to have the highest level of standards for the science and the scholarship. And at the same time, they have to be ready to adapt and change their thinking. And so you have to have great people and great science. And then you need great investors that hopefully can hang with you. And it's hard because, you have obligations to the people that invest in your funds, and you have to deliver returns to them. So you have your own difficult decisions to make. But, when I feel the magic is when I have an investment team that has conviction and really believes that we can make a difference with the company and is willing to kind of hang in there with us even when things don't always go according to plan. So you have to tack and jive and so on in the sailing parlance. But when you have that, I mean, I've often told my students, especially the ones that are working now in companies with me, when they have their moments of frustration, and for them it's like the first big obstacle they've had to deal with in their life because they're young, I tell them that, successful entrepreneurship in many ways is a war of attrition. And in my mind's eye, I picture company founders hanging on the rock wall, and one by one, the rocks are falling out, and their fingers, they're down to their last pinky. And if you can just hang in there, and the person who can hang in there the longest has the best chance of overcoming the inevitable obstacles and finding their way to success.
Amazing.
And when it happens, it's just breathtaking. And at the end of the day, we help patients and we improve the quality of life for people on this planet. And that's our goal.
And it's worth it.
Yep, it's worth it.
Now, when we invest, as you know, Genoa exists to lead that first round. So we're often the first capital in, the first institutional capital in, and we're engaging with founders. And we know that we know that it's going to get rough. So we talk about that. We also know that it's almost never the founding CEO who is the CEO takes the company public, right, or sells the company. It's just a very different skill set to be that visionary at the very beginning who, without any resources and without even an office, recruits Carolyn Bertozzi and investors to get going on the journey and kind of pointing at that goal.
Right.
That's usually a very different skill set than the person who, when there's 100 employees, needs to then think about growth strategy and think about pitching to the next round of investors. So how have you worked with, particularly when your founders are your students or postdocs,
right?
How have you seen them go through that evolution and maybe hand off the company to the baton to the next leader for the good of the institution?
Yes. Well, I'm, again, thinking through my companies, and I have had students who would help launch the company as a co-founding scientist and maybe a chief scientific officer, not as a CEO.
Right.
And in every case, I don't think I'm missing any of them, we knew immediately that we needed someone with business acumen, and especially to launch the company from zero, which includes fundraising, Series A, Series B. We needed somebody who had that skill set. And the scientists, certainly a young scientist who just finished their PhD, does not have that skill set yet. So I've been very fortunate to have recruited some great CEOs. Some of them was a hard target search. Others kind of fell into my lap, and in a couple of cases, like with Aldo, I had an entrepreneur in residence or an aspiring entrepreneur just cold call me with, because someone suggested that I might have a technology that is the right one. Yeah. So I've just been very fortunate in terms of having CEOs come into my companies and do great jobs. And you're right, in several circumstances, the CEO that we launched the company with transitioned out as the company grew or underwent like a big business transaction.
Right.
And they were all, very, healthy in their attitude about that process. So
it's a really natural way of thinking.
Very natural. And same with the student who's the chief scientific officer. That's a fine role for a young, recent PhD when there's 3 or 4 people to manage.
Yeah.
When companies grow and you need to have a much more sophisticated organization, sometimes the chief scientific officer on day 1 is not the right person on year 5, right? And so, and most of the time, scientists understand when the company needs something different from themselves, and they're very gracious about it. So, but these are conversations that are difficult, and you have to have them. Yeah. And I have had CEOs of my company, not many, one in particular that I can remember, actually give me the lecture about how now it's time for you to step back, and let the company, take its own path and so on. And I hear that, So I think I'm a pretty light touch, in terms of academic founders. But
that's true, yeah.
But it's certainly reasonable for someone to have a conversation with me. That's hard for me to hear.
A lot of what you're pointing to here is this sort of interpersonal dynamics, emotional awareness and maturity, teamwork that frankly is not really part of the traditional academic scientist training in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
So
do you think so?
Yeah. No, the training of being that kind of star individual performer is very different from knowing what you're great at, what you're not at, and wanting to work in a team to get to a bigger outcome than maybe one could get to oneself.
Yeah. You could even go so far as to say that the typical academically tracked scientist is trained not to be a good leader. Yeah. You're right. That's true. And I think nothing can kill a fledgling company more than bloated egos. You don't want them on your leadership team, you don't want them in the trenches, and you don't want them on your board either. You're right. You want people who are good listeners, who can understand the room and read the room, and who know how to motivate people to function as a team. And it's interesting that many academics are not trained with that sensibility, but the funny thing is if they were, I think they'd be even more successful.
They'd be so good.
Yeah,
right.
They'd be even better. We would do even better academic science. We're pretty good now.
Yeah.
We could be better.
Even more powerful. Yeah. Was there any particular training or book or aha moment when you look at your development that expanded your thinking from individual scientific training to team?
Oh, wow. I don't know if there was an aha moment so much as I think I learned by observation. And over the years, I've had the privilege of seeing how people in leadership positions function, and I've learned a lot from watching them. And so that started for me even in graduate school, and just watching senior professors, both good and bad, and learning what looks good and what doesn't look so good. And then as an entrepreneur, I've had the privilege of working with some very experienced and successful CEOs. And I just see how they manage their team, and I see how they make decisions and the way that they promote inclusion in the decision-making process. I've seen some that were better than others, and I've learned a lot just from watching just people. So I don't know that it was like a step function where I went from, not understanding to understanding, but I think I just get better and more. I just get more savvy all the time, just learning from people. I'm not done yet. I think I still have more to learn.
That is the nature of science and being a scientist, right? Is that hunger to learn and never stop
that's
it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's turn our attention to an example of one of your companies that's near and dear to my heart. As I mentioned, InterVenn BioSciences is a company that we were really proud to lead the first institutional financing in, the Series A. And I'm still on the board, still working with that company, and would love to hear about really the premise of that company from your perspective, and how that came about as a company that you wanted to found.
Yes, and it has been such a pleasure working with you on the InterVenn project. And so the backstory is that I have a long-standing interest in the field of glycoscience.
Yeah.
And glycoscience, for the listeners, is the science of complex carbohydrates. And it's a multifaceted science. And when people out in the public hear the term carbohydrate, they often think about food, right?
Yeah.
Food that you eat.
Potatoes.
Exactly, right, exactly. But it turns out there's a whole other universe of glycoscience beyond just food. It turns out that these complex carbohydrates contribute to all kinds of important biological processes in our bodies. And when things go wrong in our body, so when we develop a disease like cancer, for example, or a chronic inflammation of an organ, neurodegeneration, okay, when something goes wrong, sometimes you can see evidence of that disease in the structures of these complex carbohydrates. And those complex carbohydrates can be harvested from body fluids, including blood samples, for example. And so throughout my career, I've been interested in how do you extract the information from glycoscience to help diagnose disease. And it's a simple thing to say, but in practice, it was a very complicated scientific problem. So my lab had been working on this for many years. And all of a sudden, back in the year, I'm going to say 2016, something like that,
right? Yeah.
I had some outreach from Aldo Carrascosa,
Yes.
who was an entrepreneur here in the Bay Area with success in the tech sector from several companies that he had founded and with big exits. And he was sort of a well-known name in tech. And he had aspirations of contributing to the life sciences, and particularly for the diagnosis of cancer. And he had personal reasons based on family members who had been cancer patients. So somehow he found me, and we ended up having a 3-hour conversation. And he asked the question, why can't people leverage glycoscience to diagnose cancer? Why doesn't that exist already? Why isn't that happening? And it turns out there were 2 reasons. One was the technology was complicated, and the other was it was a big computational problem.
Right.
And
it's a lot of data, as you said, a lot of complexity.
Complex data beyond the capability of the typical life scientist.
Right.
But within the capability of a very sophisticated data scientist.
Rather simple, actually, relative to a data scientist.
Probably so, compared to the other problems that data scientists can tackle, such as modeling the climate of the planet Earth and things like
Astronomy.
that. Right, exactly. But at that point, in 2016, the world of healthcare and the world of data science hadn't quite intermingled fully, right?
We're on the cusp of the biotech convergence, which is our entire thesis at Genoa.
Exactly. Yeah. And I certainly was quite ignorant of what the leading edge of machine learning and artificial intelligence could create. And Aldo was in the learning phase about the process of cancer and glycoscience. So we discovered that the solution to our problem might come from someone with his background and vice versa. So we hashed the plan to form a company to be able to basically do a blood test and characterize the carbohydrates and look for signatures that could tell us whether a person had a disease. But of course, you can say that, but in order to bring it to life, it has to be financed. And that's where it was very important that we find an investor who was so forward thinking that they could understand not just the importance of life science and data science coming together, but to bring glycoscience into that equation. And Genoa and Jenny here stepped up and understood that this was cutting edge science and cutting edge technology that, if it could be brought together and scaled, could really revolutionize the way that we diagnose disease. And that was the birth of InterVenn.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you for recounting that and for the opportunity to discover it along with you. For me, it was a breathtaking moment to hear the pitch for the first time. Because I had been looking for something like this as an investor for over a decade, actually. So trained as a geneticist, DNA will always be my first love, but recognizing that proteins are so critical, kind of the business end of biology, what's happening in our bodies and disease. And so if we're going to really understand some of those disease processes you were talking about and be able to catch them and diagnose them, then we have to look to the proteins, right?
That's right.
They're doing the job. And so had been looking for those kinds of tools, but recognized some of the limitations that you were describing. And how do we generate the data? Right, was a problem because they are so complex. You can't just sequence them. And then once we generated the data, how do you make sense of it?
Right. Yeah. That's right.
And I had seen many pitches in the 10 plus years leading up to meeting Aldo and hearing about InterVenn. I got parts of it.
Okay.
There was the move toward mass spec, for example. It was clear that was the edge, right? We needed to do that, but it wasn't quite good enough, and it didn't capture some of the specificity that really is what glyco does. And so
that's correct.
Yeah, it was a great moment. Yeah.
Yes, and for me as well, because like you said, mass spectrometry is an incredibly powerful technique, and we use it in my laboratory, but it's highly specialized, and it requires some pretty sophisticated technical know-how to operate the instrument. And in order to take mass spectrometry from a highly specialized boutique instrument to one that, is a workhorse for a clinical diagnostic where you can process thousands of samples in a reasonable period of time. I'm so excited now to see the data that are coming out of InterVenn. They have partnerships with pharma companies, both big and small. They are processing samples from thousands of patients, different kinds of cancers. And they have blood tests to detect some cancers that right now are just impossible to detect in any non-invasive way, which will spare patients from, advanced cancers that could have been caught earlier. It will spare patients from unnecessary surgical procedures, to get an accurate read on their situation from a blood test. So I'm just delighted at the way that this has unfolded. It's incredible. We talked, and I went and visited you in San Francisco. And you talked about your other investments. And I was really blown away by how innovative you were thinking, both about the tech life sciences interface, but also about the potential of both diagnostics and synthetic biology, which was unusual at that time. And I think the rest of the investment community is a little bit catching up now. But at that time, Genoa was really out there with a vision. And now in retrospect, I imagine how that was quite risky, I think, for you guys to position yourself in that very unoccupied space at that time. And to this day, InterVenn is the only of my 10 companies that is a hybrid life sciences tech company where 50% of the employees are data scientists and the other half are experimentalists, biochemists, mass spectrometrists, and clinical scientists. And so it's been an incredible learning experience for me.
I love that. And that's, as you've heard, we're very motivated by the special magic, I think, that comes from interdisciplinary interactions. And in particular, this idea that we're seeing the tectonic forces of advances in biology, genomics, proteomics, advances in tech, data sciences, but not just the information, but also the materials, the automation, bringing that all together. And what drops out is innovations that don't belong to one category or another, which makes them incredibly exciting and potentially impactful, and also very lonely for people because they go knock on a life sciences investor's door and they say, I get part of your story, but why aren't you making a therapeutic? And then they go and knock on the tech community, to your point, has really, I think, woken up to the transformation that's happening in biology and how much that is data dependent. But they quite rightly very often don't want to take the fundamental science risk, the biology. It's maybe not in their wheelhouse. And so I saw that again and again. I moved to the Bay Area 10 years ago in 2013 to find these companies because, like you said, this is the best of both worlds. You can sit down at a cafe table and talk to someone in life sciences and someone in data sciences. It's just this incredible melting pot. But notice that there wasn't an investor kind of standing there in the middle and said, we will be both.
That's right. There wasn't. And I would even go further to say that if you put the traditional tech investors together with the traditional life sciences investors, there's a lot of friction between those communities. The timelines are different. The amount of money it takes to make a product is different. The risk profile is much different. And then there are stories that taint the ecosystem, stories like Theranos, for example, where, tech investors not knowing what they're getting into, trying to jump into life sciences can end in disaster, right?
And we'd like to avoid that.
We want to avoid that at all costs, exactly. So what you need to have are people with deep subject matter expertise and a very healthy respect for the differences between those disciplines so that you can minimize the friction. And again, you were way out in front of the trends at that time. They're really, I didn't hear at least other investors talking like this. Now that's changed, and I think you have people who see the success of Genoa and feel like, okay, I see that there's an opportunity there, and they want to.
Which is great. We welcome, and no company gets built with one investor, right? It really does require a capital formation journey from the beginning that chips away at the risk, that
That's right.
shows the milestones, that brings in stage appropriate investors who understand the company at each point and helps them get to the next level.
Yeah.
So we take that role very seriously. We know we're not late stage investors, but what we can do is be that partner at the very beginning that says, we get where you're coming from at the science. We understand the fundamentals. Let's chart a course to the kind of success and impact you want to have, and get there every step of the way. And how can we support you on that journey?
And I also appreciate that Genoa understands the value of diagnostics. So that's another,
That's also
you're an outlier there as well.
We're either brilliant or crazy, or a little combination of the two. But.
I think brilliant is where I'm going to stand on this one.
Thank you.
And the reason is, I think, again, I don't know the whole backstory behind, the two sides of the aisle around therapeutics versus diagnostics, because the two are so intimately connected.
Right. For the actual patient impact and practice of medicine,
Absolutely intimately connected. You cannot understand the right, first of all, if you misdiagnose a patient, you're not going to give them the right therapeutic. Right. Second of all, these days, I think in the era of precision medicine, that only works if you can select the right patient for the right therapeutic. And so you need to have diagnostics that allow you to open the door for precision medicine. And it's just that simple. Yeah. So I have long been of the mind that without state-of-the-art diagnostics, you can't make the best use of your therapeutics. You really do need to have both. So, and I think I'm hoping that now in the sort of hopefully the wind down phase of our pandemic era, that we now understand more than ever the value of rapid, accurate diagnostics.
Right.
Cancer patients have been frustrated, since the beginning of medicine over trying to get a read on what's going on in their bodies with their tumors. People with colon cancer often go undiagnosed for many, many years because the diagnostics will miss the earliest stages. Ovarian cancer patients, go through an incredibly frustrating journey trying to get to the bottom of their usually very nonspecific symptoms at first. And if we overinvest in therapeutics without a commensurate investment in diagnostics, we're just leaving a lot of value on the table.
Right. And spending a lot on therapies that might not work or might actually do harm. Yeah.
And having expensive clinical trials fail because we didn't choose the right patients.
That's right.
For the therapeutics that we invested hundreds of millions of dollars into already.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you calling that out, because it is something distinctive about us at Genoa. We don't invest in any therapeutics. It's not because it's not important, not because you can't make a lot of money for your investors, but because it's a relatively well-served space. And our goal was to be there for entrepreneurs who didn't have that go-to first investor. Right. Also, to your very astute point earlier, the capital journey and risks and how you sell companies for therapeutics is actually quite different from all of these other kind of product-focused companies, whether it's diagnostics or research tools or even agricultural products and synthetic biology that you mentioned that we invest in. So what we found is if we define our universe as these product companies where biology and technology converge and kind of kick therapeutics out of the room, because it's like you've got your place. This is a place for product companies. That's going to help us help those companies grow.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then also educate the founders about, what does the value chain look like for a diagnostic? Like you said, it's so different from a therapeutic. A therapeutic is almost an all or nothing situation where, if you get your drug approved, then, you have a very predictable revenue stream right over an extended period of time, as long as you have patent exclusivity. Right. And I think it's that sort of stable source of revenue that keeps people focused on this. It's very attractive, although the failure rates are very high. It really is very all or nothing. Yeah. But, I'm learning through the InterVenn experience that in the diagnostic space, there's a lot more optionality and decision-making along the way. And you can spin out products along the way in more diversified ways. That's right. So it's just a very different model. Yeah,
it's more like what we know from tech, right? So we think about how do we borrow best practices from these different spaces to help our companies. And you're right, it's not all or nothing, let's wait 10 years and hope it works. We build value all along the way in assets that could be commercialized, could be licensed, could be partnered. Right. So we find our companies have revenues pretty early on, whereas as I was training as a life sciences venture capitalist, you didn't have P&Ls, there was just Ls. You just
lose.
There was no one knew about,
Right.
Very few life sciences investors were coming from that operating setting where they were thinking about building businesses, they were thinking about clinical assets. They were often coming with an MD background. Mine is not, more a basic scientist, physics, genetics. And I find I'm motivated by, I just want to know what's happening, what's in the sample, what's happening in biology. And that's true
fascinating.
For research or for diagnostics.
That's right. Yeah.
You can't leave without saying congratulations once again on winning the Nobel Prize.
Thank you.
Really exciting for the field, and great to see you recognized that way. And as a scientist who's never been to a Nobel banquet, I'd like to know, in a sense of kind of cross-training or interdisciplinary thinking, how did you prep to get dressed and give a toast to the King of Sweden, etc.? Were there guidelines? Did you have a coach?
It's funny, no coach. No. It's interesting because, the Nobel Foundation manages all of the festivities, including the schedule and the events and the banquet and all of those things. The Royal Swedish Academy has committees that choose the Nobel Prize winners. So there's a chemistry committee. And that's a different body from the Nobel Foundation. So the foundation is responsible for all these festivities and just managing us throughout the week.
Yeah.
So we were given a very detailed schedule of events, but not much guidance on what to wear, because the history of the Nobel Prizes, if you go and just look at a roster of all Nobel laureates.
You wear a tuxedo.
They're men, yeah. There are very few women.
Yeah.
And so for the men, it's very simple. The Nobel Foundation contracts with a tuxedo rental place in Stockholm. So the men don't have to do anything until they arrive there, and then they have an appointment.
Their measurements, and then they're done.
Yeah, they go in there, an hour later they walk out with a couple of identical white tie suits, and that's what they wear the whole week. Yeah. We were told, and we meaning the few women here, just that it was white tie attire, and we should dress accordingly to that.
Which you do all the time here at Stanford in the lab.
So what did I do? I went on YouTube and Googled Nobel ceremonies from previous years to see what few women were there and what they were wearing. Yeah. And that was my guidepost.
Okay.
And then you go online. Yeah. And I just started ordering outfits online. And as a scientist, I'm not somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about fashion. Not that the two are mutually exclusive, but I fit the stereotype of a scientist. So yeah, I'd say the hardest part of winning a Nobel Prize is finding the outfits.
That's why I was worried about it.
As was I.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think we see your propensity to learn from others, right? Your awareness that I can see what others are doing, and then experiment and try a few things.
That's right. Yeah. And I was very fortunate that my companion who came with me to the ceremony has much more fashion sense than I do. So I did have some help.
So teamwork as well.
Yes, exactly. That's right. It was a team.
All the themes.
It was a team effort. Yeah. That's right. But it all worked out. So I'm
Well, it definitely
happy.
did. That's why I asked about it, because I watched the video, and it's a gorgeous dress.
Thank
with
you.
The color, the sparkle, and it was very distinctive without being over the top. So
Not over the top at all. Right. That's right.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. That's right. And the speech, I was asked to write a 3-minute speech. With no guidance other than please keep it to 3 minutes. So what I decided to do was to speak to what was an audience in the banquet hall of about 1,200 people, very few of whom were scientists. So I wanted to deliver something about the nature of the science to the non-scientist. And it didn't occur to me at that time that this would be on YouTube, and there'd be, in fact, millions of viewers, not just 1,200 in the banquet hall. Right. So now I'm really glad that I kept it, sort of targeted to a not scientist.
Broadly. I noticed you began by thanking your students and postdocs, actually, in that order.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's speak to that.
So the work that I was recognized for was work that was performed by mostly graduate students and a few postdocs, but mostly graduate students. And they were people from my lab at UC Berkeley who joined my lab at a time when I was still a young, not even tenured professor with not much of a track record or reputation. And yet a handful of students made a bet on me and took their chance to join the lab of a young person proposing to do all kinds of crazy things, one of which won the Nobel Prize. So without those students, I wouldn't have been there. And I wouldn't be here maybe either, right? So I owe my students really so much. My career was just based on their work.
Well, here's to the risk takers.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's
my
been
pleasure, anytime.
Delightful spending more
Thank
time
you.
with you. And we look forward to your future work.
Yes,
Yeah.
and we'll hopefully get chances to work together many
I
times.
would welcome that.
Great.
Yeah.